Hey everyone, welcome back. It's me, the Inner Nerd. So after a few aircraft videos I wanted a break, so I chose this, Meng's M4A3 Sherman 76 Wet. This is the first time I've built a model from Meng, so I have no idea what to expect. But on opening the box it became evident this wasn't going to be the most simple of builds. There's loads of parts that even include a workable set of springs for the VVSS suspension of this variant. To be honest, I was quite excited about the build and getting all those details in, until I saw the tracks. There's 3 identical sprues containing 300 separate pieces, with 5 pieces making up just one link. Ugh. Then in this bag are all the linking rods. My bag was obviously split, allowing the rods to escape in every fold and recess in the box. The rods even get into the glue that holds the box together, so after taking the box apart I kept them safe in a plastic tub for later. The main reason I picked this kit was to make the winter whitewash version on the box art. I've only done one whitewash tank before, and that's on Tamiya's Tiger 1, and been wanting to do one ever since. Since there's so much detail in the kit, this video was originally over an hour long, and so I don't bore you too much, I've decided to shorten some sequences, leaving in only the bits that I think are interesting. Because really, there's only so much you'll be able to take of me assembling every handle, wheel and shovel on the model. So to allow the drive wheel to spin, there's a rubber bush. Even though this is a static model, the movement will allow us to fit the tracks later on. Almost all of the weld detail is already moulded into the parts, so there's barely any room for scratch built details unless you want to add something completely new like an in-field mod. This is something I've never seen before since I don't do military vehicles often, and was quite an impressive detail. The instructions show to fix this frontal join in position before the upper hull, but with no exact fitting point, the alignment can be out like it was for me. To get around that, I took it off and fixed it to the top section of the hull. This way it was easier to get it to align to both pieces. You get a small photo etch sheet supplied with the kit. Most of the parts are for the light guards and grills. I stick these down with super glue using a toothpick which is split at the end to make it act like a fountain pen. All of the photo etch parts are moulded. These guards for the viewing glass are quite similar, so I went for the plastic part as it would be easier to apply and stronger than the photo etch. Moulded into the sprue is a jig for the light guards. This allows you to make the correct amount of bend for each photo etch piece. Since there was a visible difference between these and the plastic part, I decided to go with the photo etch ones. There's not an interior kit for this yet, but some details suggest that there might be one coming at some point. The rear of the gun is fully detailed and held in place with a rubber bush that allows it to move. I was going to paint this, but the lack of any other detail inside the turret and considering how little you actually see of it, I thought it would be a waste of time. I forgot to open up a hole on the turret before assembling it, so I drilled a small pilot hole and then opened the rest from the outside. Like we saw before, this kit comes with a set of workable springs for the VVSS suspension. It's a fight to get these in place because the springs need to be compressed at the same time as you need to align and squeeze the two arcs together. The fixing for the suspension was straightforward, so I left them off for now to add some mud effects later on and detail each assembly free from the model. Now it was time to add the primer. I used Mr. Surfacer to unify the surface. There was a tiny bit of rework needed along this join, so I sanded that smooth. Although the kit had welds already moulded into the plastic, I noticed that some areas were missing. To make my own, I used green stuff epoxy putty. This is a 2-part putty which needs to be mixed into 2 parts until they turn green. The mix starts to get sticky quite quickly, so I use some water to stop it sticking to my hand and everything else around me. Then roll it out into a small sausage. So I've heard, the thinner the sausage the better. So these are a bit too thick, so we'll say that the apprentice welder did these ones. But if you position down the join of the parts and then push with a toothpick, a weld bead texture can be applied. After some manipulation, a pretty convincing weld can be made that'll look great once it's all painted up. To add some more character to the model, I wanted to add some of my old friend Rick O'Shea. To keep this realistic, I looked at a lot of reference photos and marked the positions on with a pencil to get an idea of the placement before I went carving away at the model. Then to get the wound started, I centre punched the hole with my rescriber. All you need for this is something sharp like a pin. Now for some creativity. I use a small drill to open up the wound. The angle, depth and size can be completely up to you for which round you want to replicate. I wanted something smallish for the majority of the ricochets, as anything too big would have probably punched right through the armour instead of bouncing off. But I couldn't help but add at least one right where they used to aim. Then with the scalpel I cut away the entry to make a more teardrop shape. I added some model filler to the holes and let them dry for a few minutes before using the end of a paintbrush to push out the filler and create a fallout scene around the edges of a hit. I found something like Umber model filler to be best, as the perfect plastic putty I normally use didn't create the splash effect I wanted. You often see wooden boards at the front of the tank, which were added in the field. I made mine from styrene sheet and cut some angles to support the ends. To show that it had been added afterwards, I put some more weld beads on the supports. This time the professional welder had been in, and the sausages were much smaller. Now, olive drab has got to be one of the most varied colours ever, so I collected a sample of each green I have and compared against the references of various Sherman. The olive green that I was after is something similar to this reference photo. I decided to make a base coat using Mr Colour 303 and roughly covered the model. I wasn't sure how much whitewash I wanted to be removed at this point, so I detailed the original paintwork as though it would be left in the factory green. To make a more varied colour, I used a splatter mask made from kitchen cleaning scouring pads. These can be cut and separated to make a random pattern to mask off the paint, making a stippled effect. I highlighted the upwards facing panels with RLM02 to get a bleached effect. Then back over with Mr Colour 340 to make the overall colour a more olive drab green. This might seem long-winded, but with the mask it's actually quite a fast way to create a lot of tonal variation in one colour. The final colour was NATO green. I thought the model was looking a bit too washed out, so this green would add a bit more colour to the overall appearance. I sprayed this very lightly just to tint the model a more green to blend the colours below. This is the final result, and I think a good base if it was to be keeping the tank a factory green. Now it's time for the decals. I coat the entire model in one layer of Super Clear 3 gloss varnish. This will also protect the paint in the following weathering. Since there aren't many decals, I only applied more layers into the areas that those would be stuck. Now, I've dropped a bit of a ghoulie here. The biggest of the ricochets was placed right in the middle of this decal, so we had to do some work to get it conformed around the wound. I applied Tamiya Mark Fit Strong and allowed the decal to soften before slicing the centre. This will allow the decal to fold inside the hole and around all the details. There's two more decals on the back which were placed behind these spare tracks. I cut the section that would be seen from the decal sheet and applied that alone so it looked like it went behind. I sealed in the decal with one more layer of Super Clear 3 varnish to stop them from silvering. Then to prepare for the weathering, I coated the entire model with matte acrylic varnish. The matte coat will help with the oils I use for the weathering up next, and will be the last varnish this model receives. To create the whitewash, I first coated the model with Ammo's chipping fluid. This can be sprayed directly from the airbrush, and I applied 3 layers, allowing for drying time in between. The whitewash can be a variety of densities, from really thick to only partial. Since the second photo is basically the same tank as I was making, I chose that as my main reference to finish off the model. Immediately after the last layer of chipping fluid had dried, I carefully applied thin matte white over the paint job. I applied this really thin and uneven to mimic the hand-sprayed nature of the real whitewash. Straight after spraying, I covered the white with water and allowed it to soak in slightly. This activates the chipping fluid so it can be removed. To remove it, I used a toothbrush with relatively soft bristles. Then in a tapping motion, I removed the white, focusing on the areas around the edge of the panel where most wear would be shown. You don't have to apply much pressure because the brush will easily take off the paint entirely, so I do this gently until the effect I was after came through. After the first round was complete, I touched in some areas with a really light dust of the white again to soften some of the edges and fill some gaps. I worked in sections around the model until the whole surface was whitewashed. Some areas I focused on more as they would have more traffic from loading and troops climbing on the tank. Before any weathering, I painted in the details like the tools. I started with a base wood colour using XF49 khaki and filled in the tool handles. Then moved on to the metal base using RLM74 dark grey. Any dark grey will do, it's just I had this one and it seemed to be the right sort of colour. Finally, the wooden plank was based in tan to give it a more red tone than the wooden handles. The photos of research show some Bastogne Shermans to be caked in mud. To build up a thick layer, I mixed some modelling plaster with dark brown pigment. I stirred this mix until like a paste and then applied it to the hull. I didn't go too thick so there would be clearance for the tracks, but just enough to build up the texture. After that had dried, I darkened the bottom layer with black brown to show wet mud. Followed by some pigments on the bogies to replicate dried mud and dust. Next I mixed an oil colour to match that of the European earth pigment, then thinned that so it could be splattered off with a paintbrush to create random areas of dried out mud. Some European earth pigment lightened the overall look of the mud so the top layer looked dry. I did the same with the black brown to show fresh wet mud flicked off the tracks. I focused more at the back of the tank since the tracks flick up mud when travelling forward. I used white oil paint to dot along the top of the hull and streak down with a flat brush dampened with enamel thinner. This makes it look as though the water had eroded the whitewash and run down the tank. I did the same on the sides, dragging down the oil from the top of the panel. Some darker tones were added in the same way using grey, industrial earth and brown oils. It is important to apply only a small amount of oil so the streaks fade out quickly. Also keep the brush strokes really light so that the oil is not completely removed. I exposed some of the beads with silver acrylic paint, focusing on the areas that crew will have accessed the tank and equipment. Then subdued the area with a dark grey oil wash. That'll highlight the bead texture as well as take off the brightness of the silver paint. I use the same dark grey wash to make the contrast around the panel gaps. Now it was time to detail the ricochet wounds. I started by filling in the hole with dark brown oil paint. Then with the brush dampened with enamel thinner, I fade the edges from the brown spot around the fallout material of the wound. So I use dark rust wash from AK to add the deep rust tone in the hole. Lastly, light rust wash was used, and I dragged this down a little to make it appear that the water had been draining out of the hole. Then faded in with a soft stipple brush to fade the edges from being too sharp. To allow drainage, the fuel tank protection plate had a small hole at the bottom. I added a fuel leak flowing from this hole and drained it towards the edge of the plate. A deep brown wash was used on the rear deck to replicate dirty boot marks from the infantry. I blended this in again with the brush dampened with enamel thinner. Next, I detailed the tools. I placed highlights using medium grey oil and blended in with the dry brush. Now it was time for the tracks. So as we saw before, they're made up of 300 million pieces. There's a top and a bottom of each link, as well as an actual link either side. And then for this version, the duckbill. But it's alright because Meng supply this very handy jig to assemble them. Easy, right? So the jig is made up of the same plastic, meaning the super thin glue sticks the links to the jig. If you manage to get around this by being super careful, then you have to fit the rods simply by sliding them through each link. This is easy. I said easy. Moving on, I got these aftermarket links from Master Club. These have a lot less parts in, would you believe, and have much easier assembly method. All you have to do with these is use the jig provided and then plug. So, as I was saying, all you do is plug the link between the pads, and the pads are joined. Repeat this for all eternity and you'll have a set of tracks ready to be fitted. Whilst I could get to both sides, I primed them with Mr. Surfacer Black ready to be detailed. A base of Russian earth pigment set the tone more brown, then I flicked some European earth pigment which was diluted with pigment fixer. Then I cleaned off the pad to make the contact point of the road cleaner than the recesses. Some of you may have noticed that there are no duckbills on the tracks. That's because Master Club sell these duckbill links separately to the set I ordered, which is already £25. The kit is around 60, so to be honest I wasn't game for spending over £100 total in the pursuit of accuracy on this one. That was a good enough base for them to be fitted to the model. The fitment was reasonably easy, but the guide to use 90 links was too much. I ended up taking about 4 links out on either side to get a nice tight fit. Next I used some of Ammo's wet effects to create a wet look on the bottom of the track. The wet effects is basically an enamel clear gloss, but is easy to apply with a paintbrush and can be flicked to make wet splatters. I added more onto the mud to create some wet patches and add texture to the effect. Now time for more details. I started with a 50 cal placed on the turret. Basing it black, I coloured the bullet cases with brass. Then highlighted the body with dark grey oil, dry brushed onto the surface. I detailed the bullet tips with copper and then the ends with the silver. After this I applied a black wash to deepen the recesses. I had some stowage left over from my Tamiya LRDG truck, so we used those as well as some new bits and pieces from other kits. I made an ammo type box from styrene sheet which can be assembled with regular or super thin glue. After a base of XF59 buff, I added a dark brown oil wash all over the crate. Then blended it in with a soft dry brush to fade the sharpness. A slightly lighter oil colour was used to highlight the edges of each panel, and again faded in with a soft dry brush. An even lighter shade was mixed and placed around the edge of the box. This was to make a fake light source and make the box more 3D by highlighting the raised pieces. Next was to add some texture to the wooden panels. I used a small brush dampened with enamel thinner to stipple the oils and create a rough looking finish. Then the same metal finishing technique used on the tools for the braces. added some rust underneath the metal pieces and blended those with some enamel thinner. The wood grain was made deeper with a toothpick that scraped away some of the oils, leaving the brighter base coat exposed. I also had a fuel barrel to add. I based this in a dark rust colour using Mystical and Mahogany, covered in 3 layers of chipping fluid, then coloured in a medium blue. The same as with the whitewash, I chipped away the raised details and areas that would have been handled a lot. Some smaller scuffs were made with a toothpick whilst the chipping fluid was still active. At the moment the barrel looked a bit flat. I added some highlights with oils mixed slightly lighter than the blue of the base coat. I concentrated on the raised and flat details away from the scuffs and chips. Then blended those into the base coat with a dry brush. Small areas of rust were added using a toothpick to flick off the oil in a random pattern. This would act as a roadmap for the next step. Then some rust streaks made with the same wash. I used the bigger spots made in the flicking as a start point for each run. These rust washes dry very opaque and need to be blended. I use a small amount of enamel thinner to take off the brightest spots and fade it in a little more. With all the sewage complete, I added them onto their positions. I didn't glue them in place because I wanted them to be removable. I added a small leak from the barrel that run down to the edge of the deck. The oil dries gloss and will be a nice contrast against the matte surface of the whitewash and green of the tank. I used a pencil to show some wear through to the metal around the most access routes, picking out the sharpest edges where the paint may have chipped easily. Since this tank was operating in winter, I thought it would be rude not to add at least some snow, but maybe this was too much. I had some microballoons from AK left over from my Harrier diorama, so mixed those with some PVA glue and a couple of drops of water. Then applied these to areas of the tank where snow may have been collected. The snow can be manipulated around a bit before the glue starts to set, to make a smooth edge and mimic melting snow. I didn't want to cover up too much of the work, so kept this to the areas of the tank that weren't walked on and also facing upwards. This is the most likely place there would still be some snow left. Finally, I added some to the tracks. I focused my effort at the rear as this is where the tracks would most likely be still carrying it as they roll forward. On the lower part of the track I put the snow on the inside, then as the track came over the idler, moved to the top to imitate some sort of gravity. Back to the stowage. I made a cable from steel electrical wire which I spun into a weave using a drill. The winter vehicles often had snow covers made from tarpaulin. To try and replicate this, I'd tried a few methods using epoxy putty and tissue paper, but found that kitchen foil also does the trick. I cut a piece that I thought was big enough, then positioned it all around the details of the stowage. Then with some PVA glue I covered the foil while in position to give the cover some rigidity and smoothed out some of the sharp edges made by the foil. After that had dried, I basted Mr. Surfacer black ready for the colour coat. Now, the covers I'd seen were all white, but I think this would have been too bright to fit in with the rest of the vehicle, so I used a light grey to base the cover in a slightly off-white. I also sprayed this slightly too thick so that the airbrush spattered. This would make the paint dry rough and give a texture to the cover. For the detail I moved it onto the model and used Ammo's neutral wash to pick out the shadowed areas. I applied this straight from the bottle and then thinned with the enamel thinner on the model itself. This allowed me to control the blend and feather the edges. This gave it smoother transition between the shadow and canvas colour. I made some fuel oil and grease spills with industrial earth oil. I applied these as small dots and thinned in the same way as the shadows to blend and spread the colour to imitate the liquid bleeding into the canvas. Lastly, some wet effects to show some wet streaks running down the exposed barrel. I used the wet effects elsewhere to give the impression of melted snow. I limited this to the recesses and gaps where water could collect. The last job was to make a radio antenna. I didn't have any wires strong enough or thin enough to be cut as long as the real one, so I used some stretch sprue instead. With that, the model was finally complete. Since this was meant to be a nice breakaway from the details of aircraft modelling, I consider this to be an absolute failure. With that said, I really want to make some more armour models in the future, as they hold a lot of potential to create some interesting effects. If you want to see me make more military vehicles, let me know what models you'd like me to make, and I can add them to the never-ending wish list of things to make. Also, if you like the tutorial style of the stowage making, I've started my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. There I'm offering much more detailed videos on specific areas which you can request as a Patreon member. So it's a much more personal tutorial session than I can offer here on YouTube. If that's not for you but you simply want to support my channel, I've made a support tier for you to help me grow this channel and help me keep making the videos. And just for visiting, you'll have access to my scale model cheat sheet, which contains a tutorial on some hacks and easy tricks that will help you along with your painting. So here it is, Meng's 1/35th scale Sherman M4A3 76 wet. you enjoyed this video, give me a like and subscribe to see my latest uploads. And if you want to support my channel, go visit my Patreon page, which is linked at the top of the screen. Or jump straight into more videos like this through one of my playlists. And see some behind the scenes on my Instagram, theinnernerd_insta.